She was very energetic. She would always have a smile, and she just loved life.
There was just something so special and beautiful about her.
Baby, I'm listening to what you're saying.
I know.
I hear you.
David could be extremely charming.
He was going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life.
She would literally just carry him throughout the house.
I feel like he expected her to do certain things, but he didn't have the respect.
She didn't want to feel like she was in prison anymore.
This case is a true reminder that appearances can be deceiving.
Sheriff's Department!
He's very good at not showing that dark side.
January 2016. T and David Swims are supporting their beloved Old Miss University at a marching band competition in Atlanta, Georgia.
T is extremely bubbly, energetic. She just makes you want to just have fun.
Looked like she's just enjoying herself and singing, something she loved to do, and dancing, something she couldn't do.
The same shimmy dance she do with her shoulders.
Oh, there's David. He's trying to look mean and tough. And now she finally got David into it.
T knew David almost our whole life, really. He could be extremely charming. They look like very, very happy couple. She loved him, I could tell.
Antiata Archie, lovingly known as T, is born on November 18, 1985, to Anatoly and Alyssa Archie in Carroll County, Mississippi.
She was very energetic. She was smart. She would always have a smile. And she just loved life. When she was young, T was very helpful with her baby sister, Shalonda. They were 6 years apart, and T felt that she was more of big sister / mom.
She was the glue, she was the natural nurturer for the entire family.
T's fierce loyalty is strengthened by a traumatic family split.
My divorce was hard on them, but I would always make sure they had what they needed.
As a teacher, Miss Archie instills the importance of education in her daughters.
T was a phenomenal student. She was very determined to have straight A's. T ended up graduating high school and going to the University of Mississippi, well, Ole Miss.
T thrives in the college town of Oxford, and her time there is filled with happiness.
T graduated from the University of Mississippi in 2008, and she told me, she said, "Mama, I'm gonna catch the first train coming." So she took the first job that she was offered, and it was in Yazoo City as a teacher, 3rd grade. I was very proud.
Not long after moving to Yazoo City, 22-year-old T reconnects with an old acquaintance, 27-year-old David Swims.
I taught David in 6th grade math. He was a good student, but he was a student that thought he knew it all, but he didn't.
David had quite a reputation within our hometown. He was labeled as a bad boy.
T and David start dating. She learns he has 2 children with 2 different partners and is in the midst of a divorce.
As an adult, I heard David was a jealous person. I know that he and his first wife have major issues. Hearing things around town about what he was doing made me very uncomfortable. On the day that T brought David to my house, she came in and he was behind her. She said, "Mama, David and I are dating now." I said, "Oh, really?" He walked in with pride, like chest out. He knew what a gem he was getting. David was offering her a lifestyle that she was not used to. The streets, the clubs, the partying. This was all new to her. This was like a lifestyle that Mama tried to keep me away from. This is not a relationship that I want her to be in. But she was an adult now.
I think the bad side is what she was attracted to the most, and in her mind, she would be able to love this person and allow them to find the good side within themselves.
David claims he wants to marry T. But in March 2009, 1 year into the relationship, his life takes an unexpected turn.
T called me and she said, "Mama, David has been in an accident. He was hit by a truck."
My mom, she said that David may not live. She told me to come on, we're gonna get in the car. And then we got there, my sister was right by his bedside.
He was going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. I wanted him to go for care from his mom or other family members. But T told me, "David is going to go home with me." She said, "Mama, I love him."
I could tell instantly that she was determined to make that relationship work.
But that was the kind of person T was. She just couldn't walk away from something that she started.
T moves David into her Yazoo City home, and they start on the long road to recovery.
I think after David's accident, it was a blow to his ego because he had to ask for help. And that's really what he did not like, asking for help.
They were struggling. Sometimes he would be emotional. I definitely will say he took his frustrations out on her. I mean, she would literally just carry him throughout the house. She was going to be that loyal person for him because in her mind, that was her soulmate.
With T's unwavering care, David slowly regains his confidence.
This is David when he wanted to try to regain strength and help him be able to walk again.
He seemed to put aside his disability and began making it an ability.
Once David's divorce is finalized, he and T set a wedding date for the winter of 2010.
My heart dropped. I did not want her to stay in that relationship. Not because of the paralysis, but because he was who he was.
He said that I'm going to love her and I refuse to ever leave.
In the months before the wedding, T and David regularly visit Miss Archie.
T had come to the house, she and David, with a little baby. And I'm like, "T, whose baby is this?" That he stepped out before. And he just won't stop. My heart was telling me to tell her, get out of this. Take it and run. You don't have any obligations to him yet. I feel that she thought she was getting a husband. In actuality, he was not what he appeared to be.
T marries David Swims on November 20th, 2010.
She wanted him to just be a better person. She said, honestly, I don't feel like it's a problem. It's still our decision. I said, okay.
After T and David were married, T seemed happy. I felt like, okay, everything is going along. Maybe I just need to stop feeling how I was feeling and accept what had happened.
The couple still faced challenges.
David was not working, but T took care of pretty much everything. The stress behind keeping the bills was definitely major for T, but she felt like I have to go ahead and just be the person to stand up and do it.
T's determination never wavers.
T ended up going to university to get her master's. Everything was done online. Then she pushed David to go back to school. He started going to this IT tech building.
He enjoyed like fixing computers or fixing phones and things like that. T pushed for him to be able to get that degree. That way he could actually apply in his skill set to any job.
He graduated and did very well. I was so happy for them.
But 3 years into their marriage, T hit Shalonda with another bombshell.
He called me and she just said he was still being unfaithful. There was one incident where she said that there was someone at her house while she was at work. She was honestly very upset with that because he promised her that once they're married, it will never happen, and she's at work and she's still trying to make sure he's taken care of. I think she had gotten to a point to where she's like, well, if he's going to choose to entertain, then I'm going to do the same thing. And she said they discussed to have just an open relationship. I said, are you sure? Are you doing it to fix the situation of him not changing, or are you doing this for you? And she said, honestly, I feel like both of them. But I'm gonna make sure I stay to make sure I take care of him.
T had dreams about going back to Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, to work on her PhD. So she told me, she said, Mama, I still want to move back to Oxford.
In August 2014, T lands a position teaching 3rd grade in Batesville, 25 miles from Oxford. And David finds a job in a phone and computer repair shop.
Having 2 steady incomes helped a lot, and it took a lot of the burden off of T. I could see a little bit of relief.
The couple move into a home adapted for David's wheelchair on the outskirts of Oxford. Their lakeside street is known locally as the Cove.
My husband and my family, we moved to the Cove in 2016. Some of the couples that had been living in the Cove for a while did block party, and that was the first time I got to meet T and David. They seemed like a very sweet couple. David was in the wheelchair. He seemed like it didn't slow him down. Even from a distance, you could tell T was just warm, and there was just something so special and beautiful about her. Something made people gravitate towards her. She had such a very open and welcoming personality, and it just attracted everybody. If you were the person standing against the wall at a party, that's where she would go. She would come straight to you. She had a way of pulling people out of their shells. She definitely wanted to make everybody feel included and be a part of what was happening. We talked for a few minutes, found out that she was teaching at the school that I went to. We just we shared so much similarities in, where our life paths had taken us. It just seemed like it was gonna be great to have a friend who's a neighbor instead of a neighbor who's a friend.
I gathered that they were making really good friends because whenever I drive up there, we'll be walking around the Cove and this is my mom, this is my mom.
I got to meet Miss Archie pretty quick. We were standing in the yard and T said, "Hey, come meet my mama." And I walked over and the first thing Miss Archie did was hug me. Before she even knew my name, she hugged me and I was like, this is where T got it from, you know, and it was just, you felt like part of her family immediately.
As the months pass, more new families move to the Cove.
The ladies who were new in town, we started exchanging phone numbers and started a group text. T actually named the group the Cove Queens. We started going out for each other's birthdays. Kind of became a monthly thing after that. This was one of our Cove Queen nights. T learned a TikTok dance and she was showing it off. She was so proud of herself for learning how to do that dance. T was the party. T was absolutely the party. If she was there, you already knew it was going to be a good night.
But beneath the smiles, there are growing cracks in T's relationship.
Basically, it is the 13 stars around, but the Confederate...
My damns. I'm listening to you. Baby, I'm listening to what you're saying.
I know.
I hear you. Baby, I hear you.
Seems like T is working on a paper, and she's probably trying to get some serious business taken care of, and he's being silly.
My damns, put it out.
Being a comedian. T looks genuinely upset.
My damns.
I feel like he expected her to do certain things, but he didn't have the respect that I would feel a man should have for his wife.
My damns, put it off, yo.
T confides in her sister that David is not respecting their personal agreement either.
Having the open relationship did not work. He was just extremely jealous. T said he could do pretty much anything, but he wanted to make sure he kept the control over whatever she did. She had no privacy. He would call from her phone people that he would assume would be a male, even if it's a coworker, saying things like, "Oh, that's my wife, I don't want you calling her." It was definitely a way that he could manipulate and maneuver to have his infidelities and just take, really. He's very good at not showing that dark side that she would see, the cruelty with his words. We were talking every day. She just burst out to crying, and I didn't know what to do. I think she realized that she wanted better, and she didn't want to be, her words, she didn't want to feel like she was in prison anymore.
6 years into their marriage, David and T's relationship problems persist. Unaware, Miss Archie continues to visit her daughter on weekends.
I would go and stay with them. So that particular Friday, I made it up there, and I noticed all of David's clothes was in the back bedroom. That's the room I always stayed in. She didn't let on that they were having marital problems, but I started paying attention a little bit more.
It definitely became more apparent that they were having issues, whereas normally she was there for every Cove Queen's dinner. There was a few where she would miss. That was definitely something noticed because she was the party. I know there were things that she held back. She was just always part of the support system, but very rarely was she one that would come out and say, "I have a problem with something that's going on in my life."
Despite David's controlling behavior, T never stops striving. And in April of 2021, she completes a lifetime goal.
She did send us a group text to let us know that she was just waiting to hear if she got her PhD or not. We just started calling her Dr. T, just to kind of boost her confidence because we knew she had it. I knew she had been undergoing a lot of stress with everything, and I said, hey, we're going out. We're gonna relax and enjoy it. And so the next day, we went to go get our nails done, happy and laughing and kind of calm and relaxed. And then she got a text from David, and she just immediately started tensing up. And from that point on, he was constantly texting her. Who are you with? What are you doing? Why are you there? That was the moment where I saw exactly how jealous and kind of possessive he could be.
I would say it was almost like the higher she climbed, the actions got a lot more controlling.
It was so much tension, you could cut it. T would come and spend more time at my house by herself, come on a Friday and go back home on a Sunday. She was always saying, everything fine, but it wasn't fine.
With T spending more time away, David often takes sole charge of his children, spending time at a local gun range. But his mood deteriorates.
What did you do? Huh? Did you fight? What did you do? Hit the TV with what?
The fact that David's kids were there and T was not is very telling.
She said that it had gotten to a point to where things were unbearable. And he would say things that you shouldn't just say to someone that you love. She had enough, and she was tired of being watched 24 hours like a day. So she made the decision to get a divorce. She decided he would have one half of the house and she would have the other portions.
T returns to her mother's house on the weekend of June 4th, 2021.
We sat in the kitchen and we talked. She said, Mama, it's over between David and I. She said, I'm tired of David's arrogance, and I'm tired of him telling me what I can and cannot do.
T finally admitted that maybe she should have listened to Mom. I was very relieved. T deserved so much more.
And then that Sunday, before we left the house, David drove up. And the look in her eyes was fear, was pure fear. I went to the door, walked on out to his truck. I said, hey, David, what's going on? Is T here? I said, yeah. He was telling her, T, I just want to talk to you. She said, David, I'm done. I am done with you, and I am done with this situation. David drove on off. The first thing that came to my mind was, maybe he ain't coming back. I'm like, wow, that was good to me. We went to fishing, and Shalonda came on up there. She and T was sitting out on the bank. I said, hey, y'all, look at me. And I snapped that picture.
T felt relieved. She dedicated pretty much everything, and she put everything on hold. It was almost like I could just see the light coming back into her eyes. And she felt safe.
At the end of the weekend, T returns to Oxford with plans to put the house up for sale.
She got in the truck and left that Sunday. The realtor was supposed to be there that Thursday at 2 o'clock. That Tuesday night, she called me back. She said, hey, Mama, what you doing? I said, nothing. And so I said, you got a glass? Let me go get a glass. So I went and got a glass, and I poured some wine in there. I said, where's David? And she said, he up in there somewhere. That was her exact word to me. He up in there somewhere. We were sitting there just talking. And then when we get ready to get off, we tapped the screen. She tapped hers and I tapped mine. Good night. I said, I love you. She said, I love you too. That Wednesday morning, she was supposed to call me. I didn't get that call. So that Wednesday afternoon, about 1:30, I called her phone. Went straight to voicemail. I said, that's not like T. And then I didn't get a call back. Definitely not like her. So I waited and waited. Then I got a text message on my phone. Just said, "Hey Mom, I'll talk to you later." All of the words was jammed up together, no punctuation. When T would send a message, you better know it was gonna be correct. It didn't make sense. I called her phone that Thursday before she left school. I got a message saying, "Hey Mom, in a meeting, I'll call you later." No punctuation. Mom was lowercase. I just felt something was wrong. So that Friday morning, I left to go to Oxford.
Fayette County Sheriff's Department.
Yes, we need to make a report in regards to a very serious matter. One of our co-workers called and basically said that he was involved in a murder a few days ago, and it's like apparently everything's still like it was at the house, like he hasn't come into work.
Dispatch had a male subject on the line saying that he had shot his wife. He was currently still inside the house. As I got closer to the neighborhood, dispatch did relay information that the suspect was possibly in a wheelchair. Most important thing when we arrive on a scene to a call of this nature is safety. Try to find out where the suspect's at and secure the residence as quickly and as safely as possible. I remember the garage door kind of opening.
Hey man, come on out.
And I could see a male coming outside in a wheelchair. My greatest worry or fear is that he was still armed with a weapon. Appearances can be deceiving.
You getting done anything? No, let's clear.
After we secured the suspect, we start making our way through the residence room by room.
Sheriff's Department!
We're constantly on high alert. There could be a threat that pop out behind a corner.
Yes, Father.
As I was making my way through the kitchen, I do remember seeing a couple firearms on the bar in the kitchen. At this point, we just bypass them because this is Mississippi. Nothing unusual to see a gun laying on a counter. Once I got to the bedroom, I could see a comforter laid on the floor.
Yeah, she's cold.
It appeared that she had been there for a period of time. So at this point, I asked the deputies to exit the residence with me because this has now become an active crime scene.
What's your wife's name?
Antiata, A-N-T-E-A-T-T-A.
You really never know what you're going to get when it comes to a murder suspect.
You know her date of birth?
November the 18th, 85.
I would say that the suspect's demeanor was very calm. He didn't really say much. He was very nonchalant.
We were out shopping, and one of our neighbors right across the street messaged in our group text and said, "Hey, there's a lot of police officers outside your house. T, is everything okay?" And T never responded. One of the other ladies in our circle had married a sheriff's department officer, so he immediately ran over to see what was going on. He texted in the big group text, "Everybody stay away from this side of the circle. Don't ask questions. Just don't come over here." My husband was still at home and was kind of watching to see like what's happening right next door. He called me and let me know that a coroner van had shown up. And then my husband texted and said, "I see David outside talking to the police officers while the coroner van is there." And I immediately just, it hit like a tidal wave.
The suspect was placed in a patrol vehicle. I followed that vehicle back to my office at the Lafayette County Criminal Investigations Building.
Still on the road, Miss Archie remains unaware of what has happened to her daughter.
I called David's phone. He didn't answer.
The number cannot be reached.
So I called Dave's mom's phone. She didn't answer. I said, somebody need to call me. What is going on? She called my phone and said, Auntie Ada is dead, and hung up. And I just lost it. When I made it to the home, yellow tape all the way around the house. And that policeman walked up to the car and he said, I said, what's going on? He said, well, ma'am, there was a deceased female in the house. All I could think about was, I know this ain't true. I know this is not true. But it was true. It's like a gut-wrenching, it's just a hurt that just won't stop.
David Swims was placed in our interview room. The only thing I was aware of is the 911 call that he had made, claiming that he had shot his wife. So I went into the interview trying to figure out exactly what happened. But once he was read his Miranda rights, he invoked his rights. So unfortunately, we had to end the interview at that point.
Officers obtain a search warrant for the property.
A knife was recovered on the scene towards the back of the bathroom where T was found. T had 3 entrance and exit wounds indicating that she had been shot 3 times. There were 3 bullet holes in the wall behind where she would have been. Those bullet holes weren't in a tight group. They actually moved the way that I perceived it from left to right. The bathroom where T was found clearly had been cleaned. It should have had more blood in it.
Something that struck me very odd. Written in the very center of the kitchen counter by the firearms, with a black Sharpie were the words pain, lies, and deceit. We also noticed the picture frames on the bookshelf. They were turned face down. And then I started looking around the residence and I noticed that all the other photographs were turned over. I picked one up. I saw that it was David Swims and what appeared to be the deceased female. It was like the suspect couldn't look at the victim after what he had done.
David Swims is charged with first-degree murder and a secondary count of felonious possession of a firearm.
Bail was set at $100,000. David was able to hire a bail bondsman. Generally speaking, that bail bondsman only requires 10% of that payment to sign on to that bond.
The next day, David posts $10,000 bail and is free to leave.
$10,000 for my daughter's life. I'd go out in the yard and dig up $10,000.
I still don't understand it. But he was released extremely quickly. I really had to pray so that I wouldn't do anything that would take me away from my kids. Those were the hardest days because it's like everybody was frozen, like wondering if, are we really gonna get justice?
They were clearly very emotional. However, I needed them to be strong. My goal is to get a conviction first and foremost. Second of all, send Mr. Swims to prison for as long as possible.
David did come back to the Cove. He moved right back into the house. That was a very, very hard time. There was all the anger I had towards him for what he did. There was a certain amount of fear. Somewhat, in a way, became a recluse, because anytime I stepped outside, that was a chance I was going to see him.
He went back to work. He was an arrogant person. He was going on living his life. But he took my daughter's life. Somebody sent me the video of him out at a club 2 weeks after he murdered my daughter. It just turns my stomach.
On Monday, September 19th, 2023, the trial finally begins. When David testifies, it's the first time he gives his full version of events.
David Swim's defense was that he came into the bedroom where T was, that they had a confrontation with one another, that T picked up a knife. David testified that T lunged at him sideways with the knife. He picked up the gun that T had in the bedroom, and that's where he shot her. He describes himself as firing blindly at somebody who's attacking him, covering his eyes when he shoots her. I argued in this particular case to the jury that it was not self-defense. It was clear, speaking to witnesses and looking at the forensic data that was recovered from both cell phones, that the relationship was dissolving. In a case like this, the motive often becomes very clear. The defendant did not want her to go and would do anything to prevent her from going. The argument that I made to the jury was that Mr. Swims entered that room where T was, that he brought the firearm with him with a deliberate design to kill T. T had 3 entrance and exit wounds indicating that she had been shot 3 times. There were 3 bullet holes in the wall behind where she would have been. Those bullet holes weren't in a tight group, indicated not that T was coming at David, but that T was trying to get away from David, and that he knew exactly how to aim. If T was coming at him with the knife would have dropped somewhere in the center of the room where he shot her, as opposed to in the back of the bathroom where it was ultimately recovered. That indicated that the knife clearly appeared to have been placed. Miss Archie brought the information to law enforcement, indicating that the text messages that she received from T's cell phone clearly was not from her. That David Swims, being the only other person who had access to that cell phone, sent those text messages, indicated that he was trying to cover up for his crime. The length of time between when T was murdered and when David Swims called law enforcement gave Mr. David Swims 2 days roughly to clean up, to come up with a story. He was very intelligent and physically fit from the waist up, but I believe he was unable to completely clean up the crime scene, and he had no choice but to say that he had shot her in self-defense.
When we finally made it to court, I learned the gruesome details of how my daughter died. When I got up on stand to give my victim impact statement, I looked dead in his eyes. I said, "David Swims, do you hear me? This will hurt me until the day God calls me home." And he just sat there. He never responded. He never acknowledged. He showed no remorse.
The trial lasts 3 days. On Thursday, September 21st, the jury returned with their verdict.
When the judge asked for the verdict to be read, The foreman stood up. He said, "Guilty."
Despite the prosecution working for a first-degree murder conviction, the jury remained unconvinced the crime was premeditated.
The jury accepted that his actions, instead of being deliberate in nature, were depraved in nature, which is second-degree murder. I'm satisfied with that verdict.
The jury also found David guilty of felonious possession of a firearm.
Mr. Swims received a sentence of 40 years to serve, 2 of those years suspended, 38 years in the custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections.
I don't know if I'd say I'm satisfied with that, but I'm happy with that because that's just like a lifetime for him. When they heard the truth, they knew what a monster he was. And he was one of a person that could not be changed. It was his way or no way.
There was a small sense of relief, but at the same time, it wasn't full closure. Because while it was closure for her family and friends as far as justice has been served, you never really gain closure when someone like that is taken in such a violent manner from someone who was such a non-violent and peaceful person. While it did feel a little bit like a victory, it just kind of brought back the day she left all over again. She was strong, she was compassionate, she was loving. She was just with the wrong person.
T had a big hand in assisting him, helping him, and nursing him back from that accident. She sacrificed, she gave everything for his life, and then he took hers.
I remember my sister as the peaceful dove, the helper, the nurturer, the leader. That was my one person that knew everything about me, and I knew everything about her.
I like to remember my daughter as the vibrant young woman that she was. And she would always tell me, "Mama, just do it. If it's something you want to do, just do it."
Smile like you're happy. I know it.
My daughter was loved. She was very much loved. But I'll never be the same.
Los Angeles in the summer of 1969 still believed in its own reflection, from the hills. The city looked less like a real place than a luminous promise spread under warm night air, a kingdom of swimming pools, glass doors, expensive silence, and roads that curled upward into neighborhoods where people spoke softly because they believed they had climbed above the ordinary noise of danger. On Cielo Drive, the night of August 8th seemed made of that promise. The heat of the day still clung to the wood and stone. The leaves barely moved, and the lights below in the basin glittered with the calm arrogance of a city that thought beauty was a form of protection. Inside the house, life was not dramatic. That is the first cruelty of this story. Nothing in those hours announced myth. There was no thunder, no warning that sounded like fate. There was only the ordinary tenderness of a private evening. People were tired. People were talking. A woman who was 8.5 months pregnant moved through rooms already shaped by expectation, by the near future, by the gentle rearrangement of life around a child who had not yet taken his first breath. A friend sat nearby. Another stood, stretched, crossed from one room to another. A young man outside the gates, there for reasons so small and human they make the whole case feel even crueler, had no idea that he was seconds away from stepping into one of the most infamous nights in American criminal history. This is where the story truly begins. Not with Charles Manson in the desert of his own damaged mythology, not with newspaper headlines. Not with the cult image that would later stain an entire decade, but with a house suspended above Los Angeles while the people inside still belong to the future. The reason these murders still wound the imagination more than half a century later is not only their savagery, it is the contrast. The unbearable contrast, a pregnant actress on the verge of motherhood. Friends gathered in a beautiful home, a city still intoxicated by youth. Reinvention, music, sex, freedom, and the expensive illusion that the worst things in America happen somewhere else, somewhere lower. Darker, rougher, farther from the hills. Then, moving upward through the dark, another California arrived. Not the photographed one, not the California of premieres. Magazine covers, canyons, and carefully tended gardens. This other California smelled of dust, sweat, old leather, and dirt ground into bare feet. It came from ranches, stolen cars, hard-eyed obedience, drug haze, emotional starvation, and the hypnotic authority of a man too small for the power he held, except that power like his does not depend on size. It depends on hunger, on recognizing the broken places in other people and making those broken places kneel. By the time the killers reached Cielo Drive, Charles Manson had already done his real work. The knives were only the final tools. The true crime, in one sense, had begun much earlier. In the slow corrosion of young minds, he had taken drifters. Girls aching for love, boys aching for purpose. People who wanted family because the world had given them none worth trusting, and he had emptied them out just enough to fill them with himself. That is what makes this case different from many others. The man most responsible was not physically present in the first house as the blood was spilled. Yet his will saturated the night. He had entered those rooms before his followers ever crossed the threshold. He had entered through language, through paranoia, through humiliation, through manufactured revelation. By August of 1969, he no longer needed to force every movement. He needed only to give the command. The city, meanwhile, could not yet understand what was coming for it. California was still living inside a dream already beginning to rot from underneath. The late 60s had promised transcendence. Throw away the old world, tear down the false morals. Create new communities, love freely. Reject war, reject greed. Reject the dead machinery of your parents' lives, but anywhere there is a dream large enough to attract the wounded. There will also be predators who learn to speak in the dream's vocabulary. Manson learned quickly. He borrowed the language of freedom and filled it with domination. He borrowed the image of spiritual rebellion and filled it with submission. He borrowed the soft edges of the counterculture and sharpened them into a weapon. By the time he looked toward the houses in the hills, he was not trying to join the world above him anymore. He wanted to scar it. He wanted to prove that no gate, no fame, no money, no rising Hollywood generation could keep out the chaos he believed he had become. There is something particularly terrifying about crimes that do not begin from practical need. A robbery can be understood. Even while it is condemned, revenge follows a line. However broken, lust, greed, jealousy. All of them leave traces that the mind can reluctantly map. But the Tate LaBianca murders were different. They belonged to a theater of violence. They were committed not only to kill, but to signify, to stain, to produce dread larger than the bodies on the floor. That is why this story feels like a curtain being ripped, not just over one household, but over an entire era. Before that night, Hollywood still seemed capable of insulating itself with style. The hills still meant elevation, privacy, escape. The 60s still retained enough innocence for people to believe that idealism, beauty, and excess were all part of the same bright rebellion. After that night, the dream looked different. It looked penetrable. It looked foolish. It looked like a stage set with blood drying on it. And yet, if we stay only with the symbolism, we betray the dead. So the hook of this story cannot be only that America lost part of its innocence in August 1969. It must also be that real people lived their last ordinary evening before becoming historical shorthand. Sharon Tate was not a symbol while she moved through that house. She was a woman carrying a child. A wife whose husband was away. A daughter. A friend. Jay Sebring was not a footnote in someone else's tragedy. He was a man with his own loyalty, his own history, his own place in that room. Abigail Folger was not merely an heiress. Wojciech Frykowski was not merely a foreign guest. Stephen Parent was not merely the boy at the wrong gate at the wrong time. They were all still fully alive in the hours before the violence, and that is exactly what makes the violence feel so bottomless. It did not descend on abstractions. It descended on breathing lives that still believed morning would arrive in sequence. Carrying coffee, phone calls, heat, errands, and the unfinished business of being human. Then there was the second night. Because this case did not end with one eruption. That is another reason it remains so disturbing. One massacre, however monstrous, can sometimes be locked away in the mind as an exception. But the killings of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca the following night transformed the horror into something larger and colder. It was no longer possible to say that a particular house, a particular social circle, a particular beautiful address had somehow drawn a private storm. The violence had moved. It had crossed from one kind of home into another. It had proven that this was not merely blood spilled at the center of celebrity culture. It was a contagion of obedience and delusion now looking for walls to write on, bedrooms to profane, married lives to rupture. That movement from one house to another gave the case its final shape. Not just slaughter, but campaign. Not just rage, but message. Not just madness, but directed madness. If this story grips people so fiercely even now, it is because it forces several nightmares into the same frame. It is the nightmare of charisma turned predatory, the nightmare of privilege revealed as fragile theater, the nightmare of young followers whose faces still look almost innocent in photographs until you remember what their hands did, the nightmare of California's golden self-image punctured so deeply that the wound became cultural memory. But above all, it is the nightmare of domestic space violated by an idea. A house can recover from theft. A room can be repainted after almost anything. What happened in those homes was worse because it attached itself to meaning. Bedrooms ceased to be bedrooms. Doors ceased to be boundaries. A hillside view ceased to mean safety. The murders told the entire country that beauty was not protection. Fame was not protection. Marriage was not protection. Pregnancy was not protection. And the private world behind a locked door could be overrun by people who did not know you, did not hate you personally, and did not need to. That last truth may be the darkest of all. Many crimes are terrifying because they grow out of motive. These murders were terrifying because motive dissolved into ideology, performance, and surrender to another man's diseased imagination in a perverse way that makes the victims feel even more vulnerable, not less. They were not trapped in some intimate war of their own making. They were swept into a fever dream carried up from the dust by people who had traded away conscience for belonging. And the house on Cielo Drive, glowing softly above Los Angeles, had no language for that kind of invasion. None of them did. That is where part one must leave us, not inside the forensic detail. Not yet in the investigation. Not yet with the names of every killer or every turn of courtroom spectacle. But on the edge of the breach, a city glowing below. A warm August night, a pregnant woman almost at the threshold of motherhood. Friends in a beautiful house, another couple elsewhere in the city already asleep in the ordinary trust of marriage. And moving through the dark between those homes, the human machinery of a delusion that was about to kill not only 7 people, but an entire idea of what California had believed itself to be. That is the true hook of the Tate LaBianca murders. Not simply that they were horrific, though they were, Not simply that they were famous, though they became infamous, but that they arrived at the exact moment a decade still wanted to believe in its own innocence, and they answered that innocence with knives, blood, and a silence afterwards so enormous that American culture has never fully stopped listening to it. What makes the opening of this case so difficult to shake is that every major element seems to arrive already carrying symbolic weight, yet each symbol is anchored to flesh. The unborn child Sharon carried is not merely innocence in the abstract. It is the physical fact of tomorrow resting inside a body that still trusted the night. The house is not merely privilege. It is a place where glasses were set down. Shoes were slipped off, tired people leaned back into chairs. And a woman nearing motherhood could still imagine that the next sound she would hear might be a friend speaking softly from another room. Even the road leading up to the property matters. Because roads in California usually mean access, glamour, arrival. On this night, it became the route by which delusion climbed toward beauty. That reversal is the hidden engine of the whole story. Every comforting image turns against itself. Warm weather becomes vulnerability because windows stay open. Distance from the city becomes vulnerability because help is farther away. Fame becomes vulnerability because it invites projection. Friendship becomes vulnerability because it lowers the guard of the evening. Pregnancy becomes vulnerability because hope itself now has a body. And below all of this, in another part of the same state, a different sort of gathering had been preparing for exactly that reversal. At Spawn Ranch, beneath the dirt, the horses, the communal mess, and the counterfeit tenderness of life in the family, the atmosphere was not dreamy at all. It was tense, rehearsed, contaminated by the permanent emotional weather Manson created around himself. He made every insecurity useful. He made every grievance cosmic. He took ordinary frustration, sexual confusion, racism, fear, and longing, and wove them into a private mythology grand enough to justify anything. That is why the murders still feel larger than the bodies. Even while the bodies must remain the center of our moral attention, the killers did not simply lose control. They carried someone else's script into those homes. They walked up the hill already thinking in borrowed language, already severed from the ordinary human hesitation that might have saved a life. That knowledge is the cold breath at the edge of this story. The people inside Cielo Drive did not only face armed intruders, they faced human beings who had already practiced the death of conscience long before they ever stepped through the door. By then, pity itself had become weakness in the family's religion, in the months before the murders. California looked like a place where history had loosened its collar. The old rules seemed exhausted. Hair was longer, hemlines freer, music louder, boundaries softer. And the word liberation had begun to move through the culture like perfume. It floated from the Sunset Strip to Topanga Canyon, from Laurel Canyon parties to desert communes, from recording studios to cheap apartments where young people with no money and too much faith sat cross-legged on the floor talking about love. Revolution, the death of the ego, and the birth of some cleaner, truer world. Los Angeles was not just a city in that moment. It was a machine for manufacturing permission. Permission to leave home, to reject parents, to drop out, to reinvent yourself, to sleep with strangers, to call a drug experience spiritual, to call hunger simplicity, to call chaos freedom. It was a city where the fantasy of self-invention had become so vivid that thousands of people crossed deserts and state lines believing they could shed their old names and step into a more meaningful existence beneath the California sun. That was the stage. But the stage was already rotten in places, because every culture that worships freedom without building structures of care eventually creates openings for predators who know how to imitate revelation. Charles Manson did not invent the brokenness that fed his power. He found it waiting for him in the young, the lonely, the parentless, the abused, the hungry, the insecure, and the spiritually theatrical wild dictionary. He looked at a generation trying to outrun emptiness and understood that emptiness could be governed. The world that produced Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski's Circles of Beauty Film and cultural prestige also produced the roads, ranches, and stray emotional debris out of which the family took shape. That is why the setting and background of this case matter so much. The murders did not descend on California from nowhere. They rose from fissures already present in the dream. One California sat above the city in houses with views and polished floors. Another California slept in the dust, in stolen vehicles, in abandoned film sets, in communal filth, under a leader whose authority was built from improvisation, humiliation, borrowed mysticism, and the dark genius of sensing where people most wanted to be loved. Spawn Ranch, where Manson and many of his followers lived for a time, was not merely a backdrop, it was a moral workshop. Outwardly, it could look almost absurd, a weathered former movie ranch. Horses, dirt, old buildings, drifters, girls with tangled hair, boys drifting between obedience and vacancy. An atmosphere that from the outside might have seemed like just another failed outpost of the counterculture, but inside it, something far more dangerous was taking shape. A commune can be many things. It can be a social experiment, a refuge, a theater of idealism, a nest of exploitation. In the Manson orbit, it became a system of dependency, food, sleep, sex, affection, approval, shame, punishment, and meaning all moved through one central figure. Manson did not need to be imposing in any conventional sense. He was not a giant, not a grand public intellectual, not a man of obvious worldly accomplishment, but domination rarely depends on visible greatness. It depends on concentration. He could fix his attention on a vulnerable person with such intensity that they felt seen for the first time. And then he could redirect that need until they no longer trusted their own thoughts more than his. This is one of the essential backgrounds of the case. Before the murders, there was grooming on a collective scale. Not only sexual grooming, though that too. Spiritual grooming, emotional grooming, epistemic grooming. He taught people not only what to do, but how to know. He taught them to distrust their own conscience if it contradicted him. That is how a group of young men and women can be made ready for atrocity. The knife comes later. The true preparation is the demolition of inner resistance. Manson's own history mattered because it gave him exactly the instincts needed to build that demolition. He came out of prison with a personality shaped by confinement, hustling, grievance, theatricality, and a lifetime of studying the emotional angles of survival. Prison had not civilized him. It had sharpened him in a particular direction. He understood hierarchy, humiliation, submission, performance. He had learned how desperate people become for recognition, how hungry they are for a figure who seems to know more than they do, and how power can be made to feel like intimacy. By the late 60s, he could mix scraps of religion, racism, apocalyptic fantasy, pop lyrics, and psychological manipulation into something that felt to damaged followers like revelation. Helter Skelter was not a coherent doctrine in any intellectual sense. It was collage delirium, but coherence was not the point. Emotional totality was the point. The doctrine only needed to feel complete enough to replace the follower's old moral map. And it did. That is one of the hardest truths of the background. The family was not held together merely by fear. It was held together by meaning. False meaning, poisoned meaning. But meaning nonetheless, for people who had lived without structure. Even a diseased structure can feel like salvation. Meanwhile, the world above the hills moved according to a very different grammar, in Hollywood and its adjoining circles. The late 60s were also a moment of transition. The old studio system no longer ruled with quite the same stiffness. European influences were reshaping American filmmaking. Younger directors, actors, photographers, hairstylists, and writers were participating in a culture that felt glamorous without always feeling formally controlled. Parties crossed categories: artists, models, directors, socialites, and hangers-on mixed in homes where taste itself seemed to be relaxing. Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski belonged to that atmosphere. Their life was not ordinary. But it also was not simply decadent caricature. It contained work, fatigue, affection, ambition, travel, and domesticity. Cielo Drive represented a very specific kind of California achievement. Privacy without exile, luxury without old money heaviness. A place high enough to feel protected and modern enough to seem unburdened by the uglier parts of America. It is important to understand that this house did not just stand physically above the city. Symbolically, it stood above the old world. That was part of its allure and part of its vulnerability. Because one of the central pathologies in Manson was resentment transmuted into grandiosity. He did not merely want comfort or access. He wanted significance. He wanted entry into the worlds of music, celebrity, and cultural legitimacy. But he wanted it in a way that confirmed his own prophetic self-image. Rejection cut deeply because it attacked not only his ambitions, but his private mythology. By the time his resentment had matured, it no longer operated like ordinary envy. It had become cosmological. He needed the world above him to be stained. He needed proof that he could reach into it and leave a wound that would outlast every song, every party, every polished magazine spread. That is why the hills matter. That is why the setting matters. The murders were not just acts of violence. They were invasions staged against a symbolic altitude. The California of glamour and artistic freedom was not merely geographically close to the California of Manson's commune. It was morally implicated in the same historical atmosphere, a world of loosened boundaries, weakened institutions of meaning, spiritual hunger, and the belief that old limits were meant to be transcended in one world that produced film, beauty, experimentation, and success. In the other, it produced cultic dependency and homicidal theater. The same decade fed both. That is what makes this background so unsettling. It was not the collision of two unrelated Americas. It was a split within one cultural moment. The same liberation that allowed people to explore new identities also created social conditions under which damaged, manipulative personalities could build private kingdoms from the wreckage of belonging. Drugs intensified the instability in the counterculture. Mind-altering substances were often spoken of as spiritual tools, consciousness-expanding allies, sacraments of awakening. But in actual human life, drugs do not only dissolve false boundaries, they also weaken real ones. They heighten suggestibility, scramble memory, distort judgment, and can turn already fragile communities into breeding grounds for dependency on the most manipulative voice in the room. At Spawn Ranch and in related circles, intoxication was not incidental. It helped blur autonomy. It made Manson feel larger. It softened resistance and sharpened emotional volatility. The state of mind he wanted from his followers was not one of stable conviction, but of permanent impressionability. He wanted them open, porous, unstable, eager to be filled. When that openness is repeatedly paired with humiliation, deprivation, sexual control, and grand apocalyptic rhetoric, it can produce something terrifying. People who no longer distinguish between devotion and annihilation. This background is essential because without it, the murders become incomprehensible in the wrong way. They start to seem like random madness. But random madness rarely coordinates itself with this much emotional loyalty. Something had been built first. Another important piece of the setting was racial paranoia. The late 60s were already charged with unrest, assassinations, riots, and a broad sense that America was coming apart. Manson's racial fantasies fed parasitically on that atmosphere. He took social tension and inflated it into prophecy. He imagined a coming race war not as a political reality to be understood, but as a stage upon which he could install himself as prophet and survivor. The killings, in his imagination, were not simply murders. They were sparks, signs, provocations meant to accelerate catastrophe and then allow him to emerge as the hidden interpreter of it all. This is where the background turns from sordid to apocalyptic. Manson's world was not just one of sex, theft, and manipulation. It was also one of narrative inflation. He needed every act to mean more than itself. A knife was not just a knife. A murder was not just a murder. It was signal. It was prophecy. It was proof that history itself was bending around him. That delusion matters because it helps explain the grotesque theatricality of the crimes. They were never going to be private acts in his moral universe. They had to radiate outward. At the same time, the victim's world remained mostly innocent of this descending fever. Cielo Drive was not fortified like a bunker because houses like that were not built for siege. They were built for openness, for view, for air, for the pleasure of privacy rather than its defense. That architectural fact is part of the setting, too. In Southern California, luxury often came with permeability, large windows, sliding doors, terrace, gardens, open plans, transitions between indoors and outdoors that felt elegant precisely because they implied ease rather than threat. These homes were statements that nature, beauty, and wealth could coexist without walls becoming too heavy. Manson's followers exploited that permeability. The dream of openness became one more vulnerability. And just as architecture reflected an ethic, so did the social habits around it. People came and went. Friends stopped by. Assistants, tradesmen, visitors, and acquaintances entered homes with a looseness that belonged to the era and the place. There was confidence in the social fabric, confidence in the altitude, confidence in the idea that one's circle and one's house remained insulated from the rougher currents below. That confidence was not stupidity. It was the normal operating illusion of privilege. The crimes would destroy it. But before they destroyed it, it still held. That is the exact background in which the horror becomes legible. Manson's followers were also, crucially, young. That matters because youth can intensify both idealism and obedience when severed from grounding structures. Many of them were not old enough to possess the hard inner architecture that resists domination once it is recognized. Some came from abuse, neglect, or emotional abandonment. Some wanted a father. Some wanted ecstasy. Some wanted purpose. Some wanted simply not to be alone. Manson offered all of this at once, but only on the condition of surrender. That is why the family cannot be understood as a gang in any simple sense. It was a system for replacing the self. The murders emerged from that replacement. Without that prior moral hollowing out, the orders would have sounded like madness. After it, they could sound like destiny. And above all of this hovered the mood of August 1969 itself. It was the end of a decade that had started with such confidence in renewal. Yet by that summer, fatigue and dread were already collecting under the culture's bright surfaces. The murders landed not into a cheerful innocence, but into a society already beginning to fear that its dreams were mutating. That timing gave the crime an almost unbearable symbolic force. It did not merely happen in the 60s. It seemed to interpret them, or rather to expose their shadow. The idyllic and the diseased, the visionary and the manipulative, the liberated and the lawless, all met inside this setting. That is what makes the background of the Tate LaBianca murders so important. It is not just place and year. It is a whole moral weather system, a city of beauty and appetite, a culture of reinvention and drift, a leader built from grievance and predation, followers made susceptible by loneliness and need, houses designed around trust, a public, too, enchanted by California to imagine that the ugliest form of obedience could be growing at the edge of its dream. By the time the killers drove towards Cielo Drive, all of those background conditions had already done their work. The blood had not yet been spilled. But the stage, the script, the actors, and the emotional weather were already in place. The murders did not erupt from nowhere. They rose from a very specific America. in a very specific season, when the promise of freedom had become loose enough for a man like Manson to crawl inside it and teach others to confuse submission with revelation, violence with destiny, and another human being's life with material for history. In a case like the Tate LaBianca murders, the story of the victim cannot belong to one face alone. Even though Sharon Tate's name has come to stand, for many people, as the softest and most unbearable image in the whole tragedy, if we reduce this story to one woman, one famous photograph, one beautiful smile forever arrested in youth, we commit a second injustice after the first, because the dead here were not scenery around a legend. They were not supporting figures whose purpose was to magnify the darkness of Charles Manson or the frenzy of the family. They were separate human worlds, each carrying its own tempo, its own habits, its own circle of love, worry, memory, and unfinished plans. To tell this part honestly means resisting the pull of notoriety and returning, as carefully as possible, to the human scale, room. A glass, a cigarette burning in an ashtray, a pair of shoes left by a door, a casual joke, a phone call postponed until morning. That is where victims really live before a crime turns them into headlines. Sharon Tate was only 26 years old, and too much of the public memory has tried to freeze her inside a single frame. The beautiful actress, the pregnant wife, the doomed symbol of Hollywood innocence, all of that is true. And none of it is enough. Before she became one of the most mourned names in American crime history, she was a woman moving through the intimate awkwardness and tenderness of late pregnancy, carrying the weight and rhythm of a body preparing to become two separate lives. She was a daughter whose family knew the exact warmth of her voice and the softness of her manners. She was a friend whose presence, by nearly every account, soothed rather than dominated a room. People remembered sweetness in her, but not the empty sweetness of someone made only to be looked at. There was attentiveness, tact, a kind of unforced gentleness. Those qualities matter because crimes like this have a way of flattening the dead into pure visual symbols. Sharon becomes the blonde, the beauty, the famous pregnant woman, but in life she was still growing into herself. Her career was in motion, her marriage was in motion. Her future as a mother was not an abstraction but a daily, physical approach. The child inside her had already begun to reorder the house, the days, the conversations, the way she moved and rested. That future was not poetic, it was practical. It meant a nursery, names, feeding schedules, fatigue, a husband returning, a new chapter entering the body before it entered the world. When she was murdered, all of that was not just interrupted but erased before it could even become ordinary. Jay Sebring also tends to survive in public memory as a role attached to someone else's life: celebrity hairstylist, former lover, stylish man in the orbit of stars. But he too was far more than a label. He had built something from talent, discipline, and a deep understanding of image in a city obsessed with surfaces. To work close to actors, directors, and stars in that period required more than charm. It required judgment, reliability, and a presence that did not collapse into servility. Jay knew how to move in glamorous rooms without seeming dazzled by them. Yet the tragedy of his death lies not in his proximity to fame, but in his humanity within that room on that night. He was not a decorative witness to Sharon's final hours. He was a loyal presence, someone who cared enough to remain close even after romance had changed its shape. There is something quietly moving in that fact. Human attachment does not always vanish when categories change. He had history, affection, perhaps protectiveness, perhaps old tenderness still alive in some quieter form. When violence entered the house, it did not kill an archetype. It killed a man who had spent years crafting life through touch, style, and confidence, and who now faced the unimaginable collapse of all those civilized codes in a single room. Abigail Folger has long suffered the fate of many wealthy victims. She is remembered first through inheritance, The Folger name arrives before she does, but inheritance is not a personality. It is barely even a beginning. Abigail had wealth behind her. Yes, but there was more in her than the easy silhouette of privilege. People who knew her often recalled intelligence, conscience, seriousness under the social ease. She was not floating weightlessly through California's dream. She seemed to be one of those young women who had already begun asking what money meant if it did not soften the suffering around you. Her philanthropy and social concern were not a costume for the times. They were part of an effort, perhaps incomplete, perhaps still forming, to live morally inside a world that had given her every comfort. That makes her death feel especially bitter. She was not merely enjoying the fruits of a life handed to her. She was trying, in however young and imperfect a way, to become answerable to more than luxury. She had a future not just of parties and social circles, but of possible depth, of becoming more fully herself. To reduce her to the heiress in the wrong house is to strip her of that inner trajectory. Wojciech Frykowski, known to friends as Wojtek, brought yet another tone into the house that night. He was not a native child of the California dream, but one of its international satellites. Drawn into Los Angeles through talent, restlessness, connection, and the strange gravity that city exerts on the displaced. Men like Frykowski often live in two times at once, the life they have left behind and the life they are still trying to enter. That creates a kind of unfinishedness. It can look glamorous from outside, but from inside it often feels precarious. His relationship with Abigail, his place in that circle, his own ambitions and uncertainties, all suggest a man still moving towards some stable version of himself. He was not old enough to have become fixed. He was still improvising adulthood, still trying on futures. That matters. Murder is always theft. But it is a particular kind of theft when the victim is still searching for his shape. What was taken from him was not only life as it had already been lived, but life still under construction. Stephen Parent may be the most devastating figure in this chorus precisely because he stood so near the center of the crime and yet so far from the mythology surrounding it. He was not part of the glamorous circle. He was not a symbol of Hollywood's beauty or the counterculture's corruption. He was a young man on the edge of the property for reasons that belonged to ordinary life. The small errands and visits out of which most human evenings are made, that is what makes his death feel so piercingly unfair, even amid a case already saturated with unfairness. He was not there because he belonged to the fever dream that would later consume headlines. He was there because real life includes side gates, quick stops, conversations that should last only minutes, young men driving at night believing they are still inside the protective logic of routine. Stephen reminds us that mass violence rarely confines itself to symbolic targets. It spills outward and catches whoever stands in the radius of the chosen scene. He was someone's son in the simplest, most direct sense of the word. His room, his things, his age, his unspent years all existed outside the grand cultural significance later assigned to that night. He stands in the case like a wound against abstraction, a reminder that horror does not merely attack meaning-rich figures. It also strikes those whose only crime is being near the point where hatred decides to become action. Then there are Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, whose deaths the following night widen the moral frame of the tragedy. If Cielo Drive represented glamour, youth, visibility, and the California high dream, the LaBiancas represented something else: the ordinary dignity of adult domestic life, a marriage, a home, the settled grammar of a couple who had built a routine together, with all the small abrasions and loyalties that such a life contains. Leno was not a symbol fashioned for the camera. He was a working man, a husband, a person whose presence in the world would have been known not by magazine covers but by habit, by labor, by the repeated gestures of home. Rosemary was not simply his wife in the grammatical sense of the term. She was a woman with a separate self, a separate set of feelings, fears, routines, private tastes, domestic rhythms. A marriage contains two biographies at once, and also a third thing made from their overlap. The murder of a married couple destroys all three. It kills the man, it kills the woman, and it kills the shared world they have built between them. That is one reason the LaBianca murders feel so chillingly intimate. The violence did not merely repeat itself in a second house. It entered a home structured by familiarity, by the worn-in trust of people who have slept beside each other through ordinary nights and expected this one to be no different. When a couple is attacked together, the cruelty multiplies because each person becomes witness to the other's vulnerability. Love itself is made helpless. The surviving family members then do not mourn only individuals. They mourn the vanished shape of a shared life. What unites all these victims, despite their obvious differences, is not social class, not profession, not age, not fame. What unites them is that each one still belonged to the future. That may sound obvious, but in crime stories, it is often the first truth to get lost. The dead become evidence, symbols, cautionary tales, media events. The future they were carrying evaporates into plot, yet the emotional force of this case depends on recovering exactly that future. Sharon Tate would have become a mother within weeks. Jay Sebring would have continued building his work in whatever shape his emotional life was still taking. Abigail Folger might have deepened the moral seriousness already visible in her. Frykowski might have found a steadier identity, or not. But he would have had the chance to try. Stephen Parent would have lived beyond the age at which so many people still think life is just beginning. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca would have returned to the ordinary work of being a married couple in their own home. That forward movement is what the murders severed. It is why the grief is so large. There is another dimension to victimhood in this case that must not be overlooked. The families and surviving loved ones had to lose these people under conditions of public enormity. They were not given the privacy of grief. They were forced to watch their dead become national symbols in real time. Sharon Tate's family did not only lose a daughter, they lost her to public memory almost instantly. To photographs, headlines, speculation, mythology. The same is true in different degrees. For all of the victims, their names became attached to one of the most notorious criminal episodes in American history. That means the people who loved them had to grieve in the shadow of a cultural event. Every article, every courtroom development, every retelling pulled the dead back into public space. The family is denied the cleanest form of mourning because the crime itself keeps being narrated around them. This is especially painful in cases where the victims are so often overshadowed by the killer's collective infamy. The Manson family, as a phrase, grew larger and louder than the quiet truth of the people who died. Part of the moral duty of this section is to push back against that imbalance. To remember that before there was a case, there were rooms inhabited by ordinary gestures. A woman adjusting her body under the strain of late pregnancy. A man crossing a room with a drink in his hand. A friend leaning against a doorway. A young visitor ready to drive away. A husband turning out the light. A wife settling into bed. These are not decorative details. They are the substance of what was destroyed. The victims in this story were not merely selected for what they represented. They were living through the small, tactile facts of existence when violence crashed into them. To tell their story truthfully is to keep those facts in view. A house with open air moving through it. A couple's private bedtime. A warm evening where no one believes history is about to enter with knives. A pregnant body expecting morning. A son not yet overdue enough to trigger panic at home. A married pair who had every reason to assume the world would leave them alone one more night. These are the lives that were taken. They were not props in the making of a dark legend. They were not offerings laid on the altar of someone else's delusion. They were people who deserved the full extension of their days, and perhaps that is the most painful truth inside this collective portrait. The victims of the Tate LaBianca murders did not simply lose life. They lost the right to remain ordinary. They were dragged into history by force. Their final hours turned into cultural shorthand. To restore them, even briefly, we have to imagine them before the shorthand, before the police, before the cameras, before the names became fixed in the long archive of American crime. We have to imagine them breathing inside their own evenings, still unbroken, still specific, still held by the people who loved them, still ignorant of the fact that strangers were already climbing toward them carrying another man's diseased vision of destiny. And we must remember, 2. The objects that survived them. The dress hanging over a chair, the cigarette pack left half used, the hairbrush on a bathroom counter, the glass that still held the heat of a hand, the bedsheet twisted by sleep before it was twisted by fear. After murders like these, things become witnesses. They remain where the living left them and refuse to explain why those hands never came back. Families later walk into that silence and understand that ordinary objects can suddenly weigh more than stone. A coat is no longer clothing. It is the outline of a missing body. A door is no longer a door. It is the last boundary that failed. That is why the victims in this case must be remembered not only by name, but by the rooms that once answered to their presence. They were the human center of those rooms. Once they were gone, even the California air inside the houses seemed altered forever. No headline could ever fully carry that weight. The incident began before the first scream, before the first hand rose, before the first body understood that the night had changed species. It began in the dry California dark, on a road that curled upward through the hills as if climbing toward safety, toward wealth, toward the kind of private altitude where people imagine ugliness cannot easily follow. The city was spread below in glittering silence, the lights of Los Angeles scattered like jewelry across the basin. And above that vast electric field sat the house on Cielo Drive, warm with lamplight, inhabited by tired people who still belonged to the ordinary future. Inside, there was no sense of impending history. There was only the soft disorder of a late summer evening winding down. Sharon Tate was heavily pregnant, carrying in her body not an idea but a real child with a real arrival waiting just ahead. Jay Sebring was there, familiar, loyal, moving in the easy tension and affection that survive complicated love. Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski were there too, 2 more young lives suspended inside a house that still believed itself to be a refuge. Outside, another reality was climbing toward them. It came in the form of young bodies, knives, a gun, and the invisible presence of a man who had not physically entered the property but had already entered the minds of those who did. That is the first truth of the incident. The killers arrived in person, but the will behind them had crossed the threshold long before they did. Manson had already hollowed them enough that command could travel where conscience should have stood. When the car stopped and they got out, the night itself seemed to tighten. There is something especially cruel about crimes committed in moments when the world appears calm. No storm, no omen, no sound except feet, breath, gravel, the slight movement of brush. Then Stephen Parent entered the path of the violence almost by accident. And that accident revealed immediately what kind of incident this was going to be. He was not central to the life of the house. He was not one of its celebrated inhabitants or intimate guests. He was simply there. A young man crossing out of a normal errand into the worst timing imaginable. In many murders, there is a line of motive, however twisted. Here the line was already broader, colder, more indifferent. Stephen's death made that plain. The people moving up the drive were not navigating personal enmity with precision. They were carrying a mission so emptied of human distinction that anyone who stood in its path could be swallowed. His presence at the edge of the property should have belonged to the ordinary grammar of a night visit, the kind of moment forgotten by morning. Instead, it became the first break in the world. Once that line was crossed, the rest followed with a terrible momentum. The house itself did not erupt into chaos all at once. That is what makes the incident so difficult to imagine without shuddering. The people inside had a few moments, perhaps only seconds, in which the impossible still looked merely strange. A noise, a movement, a shape where there should have been none, a voice that did not belong to any friend expected at that hour. This is the true center of the incident in all home invasions, the exact second when the house ceases to obey the meaning it had always had. The walls remain, the furniture remains. The familiar smell remains, but the moral structure of the place collapses. The living room is no longer a room where people relax. It is a zone of exposure. The bedroom is no longer a place of sleep. It is a stage on which terror will now be arranged by strangers. The door no longer keeps the outside outside. The whole interior is suddenly under foreign law. At Cielo Drive, that change came fast and brutally. The intruders entered not as men coming to rob discreetly and leave, but as instruments of a fantasy larger than any one victim. They brought with them not only weapons, but obedience. And obedience makes violence colder because it removes even the last unstable residue of personal hesitation. Those in the house were gathered, threatened, forced into the impossible knowledge that whatever was happening was not a misunderstanding and not a burglary that could be resolved by handing over valuables. This was one of the most harrowing dimensions of the incident. The victims had time to understand that the rules had been abolished. They were not facing men who wanted something and might leave once it was surrendered. They were facing people who had come to impose a reality in which fear itself was part of the task. Jay's instinct, by every human measure, must have moved immediately toward protection. In a room where a pregnant woman is under threat, where friends are terrified, where the intruders are armed and unstable, a man does not think in abstractions. He thinks with the body, with the old reflex of interposing, of bargaining, of trying to buy time or mercy. That impulse is one of the most heartbreaking parts of the night because it belonged entirely to the human world and collided with something outside it. Sharon's body altered the moral temperature of the room in another way. Pregnancy is not symbolic when it is in the room with you. It is physical. It changes how a person breathes, rises, shifts, pleads. A pregnant woman in danger is never alone in danger. The future itself is suddenly visible. And so is its fragility. The attackers either saw that and continued or saw it and felt nothing that could stop them. Both possibilities are equally monstrous. Abigail and Furkovsky turned the stillness of the initial confrontation into movement. And movement is what makes the crime scene later look the way it does. This was not a single-room execution. It was panic spreading through architecture, a body lurching toward escape, another trying to resist, someone reaching a doorway. The lawn, a patch of night air that for one instant may have felt like a route back to life. The incident spilled across thresholds, into the open, onto the grass. That movement matters because it shows what the dead still tried to do. They did not simply submit to an abstract fate, they fought. They fled. They resisted. They tried to tear holes in the script imposed on them, and in that effort, the house became something almost unbearably tragic. Not just the site of a murder, but the map of resistance. Every room and path recorded a failed attempt to survive. This is the violence of group obedience at its ugliest. It is not clean. It is not efficient. It is not a sniper's distance or an executioner's composure. It is clumsy, close, breath-soaked, physical, dependent on numbers and momentum and the collapse of pity. The killers were not grand demons descending with supernatural confidence. They were young people whose inner lives had been rearranged until murder could feel like action instead of impossibility. That makes the incident in Cielo Drive especially vile, because the victims were met not by a single deranged individual, but by a shared moral vacancy. To be trapped in a room with one violent man is horror. To be trapped with several people whose consciences have all been detached from them is something colder. It means there is no real place in the room where humanity still survives strongly enough to stop the others. Sharon's pleas, Jay's resistance, Abigail's movement, Furkovsky's attempts to fight, all of it ran against that absence. And then, when the violence was over, the house no longer looked merely damaged. It looked written upon. That is another crucial part of the incident. The murder was not enough for the minds behind it. The scene had to speak. Blood had to become language. The dead had to become message. That detail changes everything. It reveals that the attack was meant not only to obliterate lives, but to create a spectacle for discovery. The killers did not just want the people in the house gone. They wanted the next people through the door to feel that they had entered a world in which civilization had cracked open. This is why the incident at Cielo Drive cannot be narrated as mere slaughter. It was slaughter pressed into theater. The next night confirmed that in the most terrible way possible, if the first massacre could still, in the earliest hours, be misread as some uniquely vicious eruption connected to Hollywood. Drugs, private resentments, or celebrity chaos, the attack on Leno and Rosemary LaBianca stripped away that false comfort. The incident did not belong to one house. It was portable. That portability is what turns horror into campaign. In the LaBianca home, the violence entered a different social world, less luminous in the public imagination, more recognizably domestic in the ordinary American sense. A married couple. A bedroom, the kind of home where the routines are made not of glamour, but of bills, furniture, meals, and the long sediment of married habit. To attack such a house the night after Cielo Drive was to announce that the first killings had not exhausted the appetite for spectacle. The target had widened from a symbolically charged circle in the hills to the very fact of domestic life itself. The incident there began, again, with invasion. Sleeping people, a home under trust. An outside force breaking in with the authority of a mission, but now there was a refinement born not of elegance, but of repetition. The line had already been crossed the night before. That matters psychologically. Once human beings have committed atrocity under command and survived internally, the second atrocity may come more easily. Not because it is less grave, but because the impossible has already been normalized. In the LaBianca house, the assault had the grim quality of labor already learned. The victims were overtaken in the most intimate sphere marriage can create, and the killers moved through that sphere, not like burglars, but like occupiers. They did not simply destroy life, they desecrated the meaning of home, marriage, and rest. Again, the blood was used to write. Again, the scene had to talk after the bodies fell silent. This insistence on inscription is one of the darkest clues to the inner logic of the incident. It was not enough that people die. Their deaths had to perform a story supplied by another man's delusion. The home had to become a page. The bodies had to become punctuation. The walls had to carry the fever dream outward into public life. Thinking about the incident in these two houses together reveals its true structure. It was not random frenzy, though frenzy was present. It was directed chaos. The people who carried it out were not master criminals. But they were no longer morally independent either. They moved inside a borrowed reality where murder had become a meaningful act. Almost a sacred demonstration. That is why the incident in the Manson murders feels so uniquely contaminating. A robbery can end with property lost. A revenge killing can end with one life taken. Here, the violence was designed to exceed the immediate victims. It sought to infect the culture through the scenes it left behind. And on the most intimate level, it annihilated the ordinary confidence of private life. Sharon Tate should have been allowed the final quiet weeks of her pregnancy. Jay Sebring should have been allowed to leave the house alive after an evening among friends. Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski should have been allowed to continue the uncertain, unfinished work of youth. Stephen Parent should have driven away and gone back to his life. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca should have slept through the night in the home they had built together. Instead, each of those lives was intercepted at the exact point where the future still seemed unremarkable. That, finally, is what defines the incident here. Not simply that people were killed, but that their most ordinary expectations were used against them. The killers came because the doors were doors, the beds were beds, the marriages were trusting, the friendships were real. The night was warm, and the victims still believed they were inside the normal world. By the time they understood they were not, the script had already closed around them. And when the killers left those houses, they did not leave behind only blood and bodies. They left behind the destruction of a cultural illusion. California's hills could no longer pretend to float above the dirt. Privilege could no longer pretend beauty meant safety. The decade itself could no longer pretend its language of freedom was immune from corruption into obedience and theatrical murder. The incident did not only tear through 2 houses, it tore through an era's self-image. And it did so with knives in the hands of the young, directed by a man whose greatest crime had been learning how to make other people kill on behalf of his hunger. By the time the police stepped onto Cielo Drive in the Pale, ruined hours after the murders, the house was no longer merely a location. It had become an argument against reason. That was the first thing the crime scene communicated, not just horror. Not just blood, but a scale of violation so intimate and so theatrical that the ordinary mind resisted it. Homes are supposed to absorb life quietly. They gather footsteps, glasses set on tables, laughter in hallways, arguments that leave no mark by morning, the low hum of ordinary human continuation. But this house, high above Los Angeles, looked as if the normal grammar of domestic space had been seized, twisted, and forced to speak another language altogether. The first officers did not walk into a room where death had simply occurred. They walked into a place where death had been staged for discovery. That distinction matters, because it shaped the entire investigation from the beginning. The scene did not merely say someone is dead. It said someone wanted this death scene interpreted, feared. The gate, the driveway, the grounds, the house itself. Every threshold seemed to hold a different fraction of the night's movement. Even before the full logic could be understood, the property already felt like a map of escalating dread. Stephen Parent's body near the car made that plain. He was not discovered deep inside the main living space as part of a neat narrative of betrayal within the home. He was outside, near the edge, at the boundary between the private world of the house and the wider dark of the road. That placement was one of the earliest and most important clues because it immediately complicated motives. A conventional killing rooted in intimate resentment often circles around its intended target and leaves secondary lives untouched unless they interfere directly. But here, the violence had swallowed a young man whose presence was incidental to the house's social life. He was not the sort of victim whose death fit easily into a theory of jealousy or personal revenge directed narrowly at the people inside. His body, found at the threshold of the property, told investigators that the attackers had arrived ready to destroy anyone who crossed their path. That simple fact widened the crime before the detectives had even fully entered the home. It suggested a scale of indifference or mission far beyond ordinary interpersonal rage. Inside the house, the scene became more terrible with every step because the violence had not remained contained in one fixed point. This was not a quiet execution site. It was a landscape of movement, a room where terror began, a passage where panic accelerated, an interior that failed to hold those trying to survive. Blood did not simply mark where bodies ended. It traced where hope had moved. That is one of the most haunting things about the crime scene at Cielo Drive. It showed struggle not abstractly, but spatially. The dead were not all found in a single neat cluster that could be read as immediate, overpowering force. The placement of bodies and the evidence of motion suggested the last frantic geometry of resistance. Someone tried to flee. Someone tried to protect. Someone reached open air or nearly reached it. The lawn, the doorway, the path between inside and outside became as important as the room itself. Detectives and technicians had to read not only death, but the sequence of desperate decisions made by the living in the final minutes. Every room, therefore, became double. It was what it had been a few hours earlier, and it was what the crime had turned it into. A living room still held the shadows of conversation, but now it also held the record of forced submission. A hallway still belonged architecturally to the flow of the house, but now it carried the trajectory of fear. A threshold that once meant privacy now meant breach. In scenes like this, physical evidence always matters, but so does atmosphere. and seasoned investigators know the difference between a house where violence happened and a house where violence was meant to resonate. Cielo Drive resonated. The blood did not feel accidental. The brutality did not feel merely efficient. There was an excess to it, an insistence, a desire not only to kill, but to overwhelm the next eyes that saw the room. This intuition was one of the first non-technical clues. Investigators were looking at a scene that had been composed in part for psychological effect. That did not mean the killers were sophisticated in an artistic sense. It meant they were serving a logic in which murder itself had become message. The writing in blood made that impossible to ignore. The moment language enters a crime scene, the case changes. A body can speak through wounds. A room can speak through disorder. But words written in blood announced that the killer or killers wanted the scene to continue operating after they were gone. They wanted the discoverers to become part of the event. That transformed Cielo Drive from a massacre site into a communication. The immediate question then was, what kind of communication? Was it meant to point toward political extremism, racial terror, drug paranoia, occult symbolism, personal vendetta, a staged robbery, a deranged performance, or some hybrid no one had yet named? The answer was not obvious, and that uncertainty became one of the central problems of the early investigation. Because the crime scene was so excessive, it invited too many interpretations at once. The media would magnify this, but the confusion began in the house itself. There was no clean single message, only a thick atmosphere of deliberate desecration. The brutality against Sharon Tate in particular shocked everyone who entered that investigation, not simply because she was famous or visibly pregnant, but because her condition obliterated any residual possibility that the killers were operating under a recognizable moral restraint. Crime investigators are trained to look past emotion, but they are still human beings, and some scenes strike the nervous system before they are processed by professional method. A young pregnant woman murdered with that degree of violence was one of those facts. It told investigators something profound before they could articulate it formally. Whoever had done this was not acting under ordinary human inhibition. The crime had crossed into a level of depersonalization where even the most immediate image of future life, motherhood itself embodied, had offered no boundary. That clue was psychological rather than forensic, but it mattered deeply. It suggested that the motive would not be found in any stable emotional logic shared by most people. The killers had acted from somewhere far colder or far more distorted than jealousy alone. Yet because the house belonged to a circle linked to Hollywood, the first lines of suspicion inevitably bent toward the familiar tensions of that world. Drugs, affairs, debts, resentments, industry rivalries, damaged egos, fringe acquaintances, all of it rushed in to crowd the early theory space. Detectives had to interview friends, lovers, employees, neighbors, and members of a social environment where people often knew one another through shifting layers of intimacy and convenience. The crime scene itself encouraged these hypotheses because it was so intimate. It had happened in a private home among known people. It had the visual density of a personal attack, even if the deeper logic would later prove otherwise. That was one of the earliest dead ends already germinating inside the discovery phase. The very excess of the scene pushed the mind toward personal motive. Because personal motive is easier to imagine than ideological theater carried out by manipulated followers of a charismatic drifter. But the evidence also resisted that easy reading. Stephen Parent did not belong to the emotional core of the house. The scale of the violence exceeded ordinary grievance. The writing suggested symbolic intent. The movement through the house suggested multiple offenders, or at least a style of attack difficult to reconcile with one known intimate acting alone. Those contradictions became the first real clues precisely because they undermined the first reassuring theories. Investigators could not settle comfortably inside one story. The house would not let them. Then came the second scene. And with it, the whole structure of the case changed. The murders of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca the following night transformed the meaning of the first discovery as dramatically as if the blood at Cielo Drive had begun to move across the city on its own. Suddenly, investigators had not one grotesque anomaly, but two homes invaded. Two sets of victims from different worlds, two scenes marked by excessive violence and inscription. Two nights close enough together to suggest intention rather than coincidence. The importance of this cannot be overstated. Before the La Bianca discovery, Cielo Drive could still, with effort, be forced into the box of a spectacular but localized Hollywood crime. After the second scene, that box cracked. The police were now staring at a pattern, however incomplete. The initial clues at the La Bianca home echoed the first scene in just enough ways to be alarming and differed from it in ways that made the motive still more elusive. This was not a continuation of a feud inside one social circle. It was an expansion. The husband and wife were not celebrity friends of Sharon Tate. They were a different kind of household, a different social atmosphere, a different branch of Los Angeles life. Yet the house had been invaded with the same appetite for domination and the same urge to leave meaning behind in blood. That repetition was one of the most important initial clues in the entire case. The victims themselves were no longer the best route to the answer. The answer had to lie in the minds of the offenders. Cielo Drive and the La Bianca house together formed a composite scene of crime large enough to force a new kind of question. What sort of people kill in one iconic house, then go to another home the next night and do it again with ritualistic overtones? The second scene deepened another clue as well. The attack was not driven by theft in any ordinary sense. Though property was disturbed and some objects mattered, the emotional center of the violence clearly lay elsewhere. These were not break-ins that escalated. They were invasions designed to dominate, terrify, and inscribe. That insight would matter later, but even in the first days, it changed the investigation's internal weather. Detectives knew they were dealing with something far more organized in spirit than it looked in execution. The killers might have been physically clumsy or frenzied, but the crime scenes themselves displayed a coherent need to use blood as writing and domestic space as theater. That meant the offenders carried some larger narrative with them into the homes. The question was whose narrative? The first clues from neighbors and surrounding terrain added yet more complexity. At Cielo Drive, movement up and down the property. The nature of the entry, the isolation of the house at night, and the relative quiet of the hills made it possible for intruders to approach without immediate notice. That said something about planning, or at least about familiarity with opportunity. These were not attackers blundering at random through the city until a door happened to open. The locations chosen, especially the elevated, private house on Cielo Drive, implied either prior knowledge or a confidence that access itself was enough. The La Bianca home, less mythic in public imagination but equally intimate in its vulnerability, suggested a second truth. The offenders did not require a glamorous setting to feel empowered. They required a home. That is an important distinction. The true common denominator of the scenes was not celebrity. It was domesticity breached. And once investigators began to see that, the structure of the crimes looked less like a sequence of targeted grudges and more like a campaign against the idea of home itself. The forensics, of course, had their own language, blood patterns, wound analysis, trajectories of movement, bindings, weapon use. All of these began to build a more concrete picture of how the incidents unfolded, but forensic detail alone could not solve the conceptual challenge the scenes posed. They could tell investigators what kind of force was used, how many opportunities there had been for escape, perhaps how many attackers were likely involved, but they could not by themselves explain the moral strangeness of the events. That is why the initial clues matter so much in this case. They forced police to read not only physical traces but also behavioral signatures. The killers had entered private homes under cover of dark, confronted sleeping or unprepared victims, used extreme violence, and written words afterward. This was not just killing, it was symbolic occupation. There is also an emotional truth about discovery scenes like these that should not be overlooked. For the detectives and crime scene personnel, repeated exposure to this level of domestic desecration changes the pace of thought. One horrific scene can be processed as exceptional, Two similar scenes occurring on consecutive nights create dread inside the investigation itself. The police begin to understand that they are not only looking backward at what happened, but outward at what could happen next. Every clue is then weighted by urgency. The letters in blood are no longer merely evidence, they are warnings. The crossed social boundaries between the two houses no longer merely confuse, they imply widening threat. The inability to identify a conventional motive no longer merely frustrates, it terrifies, because crimes without a familiar motive can repeat more freely. This is why the initial discovery stage in the Tate LaBianca murders is so crucial. The scenes taught investigators, slowly and cruelly, that they were not dealing with ordinary criminal appetite. They were dealing with a hybrid of obedience, apocalyptic delusion, symbolic performance, and intimate violence. But that understanding did not come all at once. In the immediate aftermath, the case remained a battlefield of possibilities, every clue clarified and obscured in the same breath. The blood writing said message, but not yet whose. The multiple victims said mission, but not yet why. The second house said pattern, but not yet system. The geography of the crimes said choice, but not yet logic. That is why Part 5 matters. It is the point at which horror becomes evidence, but evidence has not yet become understanding. The dead have been found, the rooms have spoken. The walls have been marked, the city has started to tremble. And yet the true shape of the thing is still half buried beneath false theories, celebrity shadows, and the human mind's reluctance to believe that a ragged cult on the margins of California could have reached up into the hills, then outward into another home, and written itself into history with so much blood in the first days after the murders. Los Angeles did what frightened cities always do. It began manufacturing explanations faster than the evidence could support them. The police stood in the middle of two scenes so grotesque, so theatrical, and so symbolically charged that almost every available theory seemed possible for at least a moment. Hollywood whispered about drugs, debts, jealousies, occult circles, sexual rivalries, and revenge. Reporters moved from mansion gates to police briefings to bars where people leaned in and spoke in lowered voices, as if volume itself could summon the killers back. Detectives, meanwhile, were trying to do the opposite of what the city was doing. They were trying to narrow, but narrowing is difficult when the crime itself appears to have been designed to produce maximum confusion. Cielo Drive looked personal and impersonal at the same time. Personal because the violence was intimate, close, and overdone, as if somebody had wanted not merely to kill, but to punish. Impersonal because the victims, taken together, did not form a clean emotional target. Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski's world could suggest envy or revenge. Stephen Parent's death shattered that simplicity at once. The LaBianca murders, committed the following night in a different household with no immediate social link to the first, shattered it completely. The investigation entered that contradiction and stayed there for weeks. That was the first great dead end. Every clue opened a door, and nearly all of them led into the wrong house. The most immediate suspects came from the world nearest the first crime scene. Friends, lovers, employees, dealers, party acquaintances, assistants, former companions, and the broad penumbra of people who move around fame without fully belonging to it all passed through the investigators' hands in one form or another. That was not foolish police work. It was the natural first route. A house in the hills, inhabited by beautiful and visible people, usually suggests a social motive before it suggests a cult. Detectives examined prior visitors, tensions in relationships, financial disputes, possible resentments against Polanski, and the atmosphere of drugs and drifting personalities that hung around parts of Hollywood in 1969. Every name seemed to come carrying another story. Someone had argued with someone else. Someone was jealous. Someone knew the gate. Someone had heard strange things. Someone claimed the killings felt like a message. In a city like Los Angeles, where image and instability often occupy the same room. Those fragments could keep an investigation circling for a very long time. And for a while, they did. The crime scene itself seemed to encourage these wrong turns. The blood writing, the overkill, the house full of guests, the social prominence of the victims. All of it looked like the sort of atrocity people commit when they need another person to understand exactly why they are dying. But the deeper investigators looked, the less persuasive the personal explanations became. The victims did not align neatly enough. The excess was too broad, too diffuse, too symbolic. It did not read like a single jealousy, a single grudge, or even a single financial motive. Yet the police did not immediately leap from that realization to the truth. Because the truth required a conceptual move that law enforcement was not accustomed to making so quickly. They had to imagine not one furious individual, but a group, not a professional group. Not a gang in the conventional urban sense, but a circle of manipulated followers carrying out another man's idea of revelation. Until that possibility became thinkable, the investigation remained trapped between the familiar categories of ordinary crime and the deeply unfamiliar reality of cult violence. The LaBianca murders intensified the confusion instead of relieving it. On paper, the second scene should have helped. 2 nights. 2 homes, similar brutality. Similar writing, similar intent to terrify. In practice, the second crime multiplied the possible readings. If the victims at Cielo Drive had not known the LaBiancas, then maybe the common thread was not social but symbolic. But symbolic in what sense? Political, racial, drug-related, revolutionary. Some detectives and observers were drawn toward the idea that the killings might be an attempt to spark fear between racial communities, or to imitate another sort of violence, or to send law enforcement toward the wrong enemy. That speculation was not entirely random. The writing on the walls and doors had clearly been left to be read, but that still did not answer the practical question of who had done the reading in their own minds first. The police had motive fragments, scene similarities, and a city in panic, but they did not yet have the architecture behind the panic. They were still looking for a recognizable criminal logic. The family had been operating according to a deranged emotional logic all its own. And that difference kept the case fogged. Then there was the issue of appearance. Charles Manson and the people around him did not look, in the public imagination, like the obvious authors of a crime that had shattered the most glamorous corner of California life. They looked like drifters, runaways, young women with unwashed hair and vacant or fevered eyes, boys who seemed too hollow or too broken to engineer a cultural trauma. Manson himself looked, at first glance, too small, too dirty, too ridiculous for the scale of terror that had been unleashed. That misreading became another dead end. American culture often expects evil either to arrive in a respectable suit or to announce itself with monstrous grandeur. Manson offered neither. He was shabby, manipulative, charismatic only at close range, and rooted in a world of petty theft, communal disorder, and sexual domination. It was difficult for many people, including investigators, to believe that such a marginal figure could reach into the center of the national imagination and leave it bleeding. But underestimating him meant underestimating the mechanism he had built. The true danger was not Manson as lone mastermind in the cinematic sense. It was Manson as corrupter of agency, the man who could make others carry his delusion into rooms he himself never entered. In the background, another route toward the truth was slowly, almost accidentally, opening. Members of the family had already been drifting in and out of trouble for smaller offenses, car thefts, burglary, parole issues, desert crimes, and other acts that seemed minor compared with the blood on Cielo Drive created paper trails and points of contact with law enforcement. For a while, those trails existed in a different universe from the murder investigation. That separation is one of the most frustrating elements of the case in retrospect. The same state, the same broad moment, 2 tracks of criminality moving side by side without yet locking together. One track looked mythic and unspeakable. The other looked grubby, provincial, and low-level. The detectives on the murder case were peering into Beverly Hills darkness and Hollywood anxieties while elsewhere. The raw material of the answer sat half visible in the dirt and clutter around the Manson circle. This is often how real investigations stall. The truth is not absent, it is segregated. The breakthrough toward that segregated truth began not with a glorious deduction, but with talk, jailhouse talk, frightened talk, self-important talk. The kind of talk that spills out in settings where people are too damaged, too vain, or too emotionally undisciplined to carry a secret cleanly. Susan Atkins became one of the crucial figures in this phase for exactly that reason. She talked in a way that was part confession, part boasting, part surrender to the twisted status system of the family. Her words floated first as rumor, then as possibility, then as something law enforcement had to grip with both hands and test against the known facts of the murders. But even that was not simple. Cult language contaminates memory. People inside such groups narrate events through the leader's mythology. They dramatize, they distort, they absorb one another's stories until it becomes difficult to separate witnessed fact from repeated doctrine. Investigators had to treat what emerged from Atkins and others not as pure truth, but as ore, valuable ore, but mixed with vanity, fear, fantasy, and loyalty. Extracting usable proof from that material required patience and skepticism in equal measure. At the center of the dead end sat a legal and moral puzzle. How do you charge a man who may not have physically committed the murders, but whose influence and orders saturate every step of them? It is one thing to suspect followers. It is another to build a case that makes the leader's responsibility visible in a court of law. Manson had designed his power precisely to blur that line. He wanted omnipresence without exposure. He wanted to inhabit other bodies, to make his desires move through other hands. That made him, in one sense, the perfect cult criminal, but it also made him vulnerable once investigators understood the structure. The more thoroughly the family's obedience was mapped, the less plausible it became that the murders were acts of spontaneous freelance frenzy. They began to look like what they were, extensions of a central will. Still, until witnesses, corroboration, scene details, and the internal language of the group aligned, Manson remained a sinister possibility rather than a prosecutable certainty. The emotional atmosphere of the investigation was brutal. Families wanted answers. The media wanted a narrative. The police needed proof. And beneath all of that was a deeper pressure. America needed the crime to make sense. Not in a philosophical way, but in a practical, containable one. A personal grudge can be filed away mentally. A celebrity drug massacre can be filed away. Even organized crime can be filed away. But a cult of young drifters under the command of a failed musician turned desert prophet, sent into private homes to slaughter strangers as part of an apocalyptic fantasy. That kind of truth does not sit neatly inside the mind. It threatens the mind. It suggests that the decades' language of liberation could be turned into a vehicle for absolute moral surrender. It suggests that the line between rebellion and fascism can vanish inside the wrong charisma. The police were not only solving a case, they were approaching the truth the culture itself did not want to believe. And so the investigation staggered forward through fragments. A statement here, a phrase there, a movement of cars, a remembered instruction. The similarities between the two nights hardened. The family's internal mythology started to sound less like gibberish and more like motive. Manson's followers, once they came into focus, no longer seemed like random runaways on the edge of the story. They looked like what they had become, instruments. Yet even then, the path was not linear. Confessions shifted. Loyalty and fear wrestled with one another. Egos intruded. The seductive noise of the case never fully quieted. Detectives had to keep separating spectacle from substance because this was a crime that had been built partly from spectacle. The killers wanted the blood seen. The words read. The fear multiplied. The investigation had to deny them one final victory by turning their theater back into evidence. That is what Part 6 truly is in this case. The long, exhausting interval in which horror is already visible, but its machinery is still hidden behind too many false faces. The suspects seemed, at first, to live in Hollywood. Then they seemed to live in some vague criminal underworld. Then they seemed to dissolve into rumor. Race panic, drug myth, and celebrity paranoia. Only slowly did the real shape emerge. A manipulative leader, a dependent circle, a doctrine of chaos, and a set of followers who had mistaken obedience for meaning. Until that shape could be seen whole, the case remained trapped in one of the most painful dead ends in criminal investigation. Everyone knew they were looking at something historically monstrous, but no one yet knew exactly where to place the monster's heart. That heart began to reveal itself most clearly when Linda Kasabian entered the frame, not as a killer in the same sense as the others, but as someone who had stood close enough to the abyss to describe its edges. Her role in the crimes and her later cooperation exposed another crucial layer of the investigation. The difference between physical participation and psychological capture. She helped investigators translate the family's inner reality into language the law could use. Through figures like her, the prosecutors and detectives could start building the bridge between Manson's manipulations and the bodies found in those houses. Without that bridge, the case risked collapsing into two separate simplifications. Either Manson as theatrical bystander with no direct legal responsibility, or the young killers as isolated monsters whose actions emerged out of nowhere. Neither story was true. The hard work of the investigation was to prove the chain. The emotional chain, the command chain, the symbolic chain. Every cult crime presents this difficulty. The leader often speaks in suggestion, implication, pressure, ritual, and constant indoctrination rather than in a tidy order barked beneath a bright light. Yet subordinates act with his voice already installed inside them. That was the structure detectives slowly learned to see as more of the family's internal life came into view. The earlier dead ends began to look less like mistakes and more like symptoms of the case itself. Hollywood had been a false lead not because investigators were foolish,